The Hinterkaifeck murders. Imagine living on an isolated farm, miles from the nearest neighbor. Winter has settled in. The nights are long and dark, and the snow lies thick on the ground. Now imagine hearing footsteps in your attic. Footsteps when no one should be there. Footsteps that stop when you listen for them, then start again when you turn away. Imagine finding footprints in the snow leading from the forest to your home. But when you follow them, searching for where they came from or where they went, you find something impossible. The footprints lead to your house. But there are no footprints leading away. As if someone walked to your door and simply vanished. Or worse, never left. This is not the beginning of a ghost story, though it easily could be. This is the true story of what happened at Hinterkaifeck, a small farmstead in Bavaria, Germany, in the early spring of 1922. A story of a family who knew something was terribly wrong, who heard the warnings, who saw the signs, but who stayed anyway. And who paid for that decision with their lives. What happened at Hinterkaifeck is one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in history. Not just because of the brutality of the crime, though it was brutal beyond comprehension. Not just because 6 people, including 2 children, were killed in their own home. But because of what happened before the murders, and even more chilling, what happened after. Because the killer, whoever they were, didn't just murder the Gruber family and flee into the night. They stayed. They lived in the house with the bodies for days, perhaps longer. They fed the animals, ate the family's food, and kept the fires burning. Neighbors saw smoke rising from the chimney. They assumed the family was simply busy with farm work. They had no idea that everyone inside was already dead, and that someone else was living among the corpses. This is the story of Hinterkaifeck. A story with no resolution, no justice, and questions that remain unanswered over a century later. But more than that, it's a story that will make you question what you would do if you heard footsteps in your attic. If you found unexplained tracks in the snow. If you felt, deep in your bones, that you were being watched. Would you investigate? Would you flee? Or would you, like the Gruber family, convince yourself there must be a rational explanation, even as the signs of danger grew impossible to ignore? Hinterkaifeck wasn't a village or even a proper settlement. It was a single farmstead, isolated and remote, located about 70 kilometers north of Munich in Bavaria. The name Hinterkaifeck roughly translates to behind Kaifeck, referring to its location behind the slightly larger hamlet of Kaifeck. But even Kaifeck was barely more than a few scattered buildings. Hinterkaifeck was truly alone, surrounded by fields and forests, the nearest neighbors too far away to hear a scream. The farm was home to the Gruber family, and in March 1922, 6 people lived there. Andreas Gruber was 63 years old, the patriarch of the family and owner of the farm. He was a widower, his first wife having died years earlier. Andreas was known in the area as a difficult man, stern and unpleasant, someone his neighbors didn't particularly like or trust. Rumors swirled about him, dark whispers that we'll discuss later, but suffice to say Andreas Gruber was not a beloved figure in the community. His daughter, Victoria Gabriel, was 35 years old. She was a widow, her husband Karl having died in the First World War. Or at least, that was the official story. The truth was more complicated and more sinister. Karl Gabriel had disappeared in 1914, and while he was presumed dead, his body was never found. Some suspected he deserted. Others whispered darker theories about what might have happened to him, theories that involved Andreas Gruber and motives we can only speculate about. Victoria lived at Hinterkaifeck with her 2 children. Kazilia was 7 years old, a quiet girl who helped with small chores around the farm. Joseph was 2 years old, a toddler who would never grow old enough to remember the horrors that were coming. Also living at the farm was Kazilia Gruber, Andreas's mother and Victoria's grandmother. She was 72 years old, elderly and frail, but still helping with household tasks as much as her age allowed. The 6th person at Hinterkaifeck was the maid, Maria Baumgartner. She was 44 years old and had only been working at the farm for a few months. She'd replaced the previous maid, who had left abruptly, claiming the farmhouse was haunted. The previous maid had told people in the village that she heard strange noises, that she felt unwelcome presences, that something about Hinterkaifeck terrified her. At the time, people dismissed her claims as superstition or perhaps an excuse to leave an unpleasant work situation. Andreas Gruber was known to be a difficult employer. But in retrospect, her fear seems prescient. Perhaps she sensed something that others missed. Perhaps she heard the footsteps before anyone else did. Life at Hinterkaifeck followed the rhythms of farm life. The days were filled with caring for animals, tending to the property, and managing the household. In March 1922, winter was loosening its grip, but the weather was still cold, and snow still covered the ground. The family worked hard, as farm families did, isolated from the world but self-sufficient. But something was wrong at Hinterkaifeck. Something that Andreas Gruber couldn't explain, couldn't rationalize, but also couldn't ignore. It started about 6 months before the murders. Andreas told several people, including neighbors and acquaintances, that strange things were happening at the farm. He said he'd found a newspaper in the house that no one had bought. It simply appeared one day, left on a table or chair, a newspaper from Munich that none of them had ordered or purchased. How did it get there? Who brought it? Andreas had no answers. Then there were the keys. A set of keys went missing from the farm. Andreas searched everywhere but couldn't find them. Then, weeks later, they reappeared, placed back exactly where they should have been. Andreas was certain he'd searched that spot multiple times before. So where had the keys been? And who had returned them? Tools vanished from the barn and workshop. Andreas would look for a particular tool, be certain of where he'd left it, and find it gone. Days later, the tool would be back, sometimes in a different location, sometimes exactly where it should have been all along. Was Andreas becoming forgetful in his old age? Was he misplacing things and not remembering? Or was someone else moving things around? But the most disturbing events occurred in the days immediately before the murders. About a week before the family was killed, Andreas Gruber discovered footprints in the snow. He was walking from the house to one of the outbuildings when he noticed them, tracks in the fresh snow leading from the edge of the forest toward the farm. Andreas followed them, trying to determine who had walked there and where they had gone. The tracks led to the property, approaching the house and barn. But there were no tracks leading back to the forest. None. It was as if someone had walked out of the woods, reached the farm, and then simply vanished. Or, more disturbing still, had entered the house or barn and never left. Andreas searched the buildings. He checked the barn, the stables, the storage areas. He found nothing. No sign of an intruder. No explanation for the one-way footprints. He told his neighbors about it, clearly troubled, but no one had any answers. It was strange, certainly, but what could be done? Perhaps there was a rational explanation they simply weren't seeing. Then came the footsteps in the attic. Several days before the murders, the family began hearing sounds from above. Footsteps, creaking floorboards, the unmistakable sound of someone walking around in the attic space above their living quarters. The entire family heard it. Andreas, Victoria, even young Kazilia mentioned the noises to others. Andreas went to investigate multiple times. He climbed into the attic, searching every corner, every shadow. He found nothing. The attic was used for storage, filled with old furniture, tools, and miscellaneous items accumulated over years of farm life. There were places someone could hide, certainly, but Andreas's searches revealed no intruder. Yet the footsteps continued. Particularly at night. The family would be settling in for the evening, and they'd hear it. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the attic floor above them. Sometimes stopping, as if the walker was listening. Then continuing, pacing back and forth. The psychological terror of this cannot be overstated. Imagine lying in bed at night, in a house miles from any help, and hearing footsteps above you. Knowing that someone is there, knowing that someone is in your home, but being unable to find them. Unable to prove that anything is wrong beyond these sounds that could, if you wanted to lie to yourself, be explained away as the house settling, as animals in the roof space, as imagination. But Andreas Gruber knew. On some level, he understood that something was deeply wrong. He told people about the footprints, about the sounds, about the strange occurrences. But he didn't leave. He didn't take his family and go somewhere safe. Perhaps he felt he couldn't abandon the farm, his livelihood, his property. Perhaps he believed he could handle whatever was happening. Perhaps, like many people facing an inexplicable threat, he simply couldn't accept that the danger was real until it was too late. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, had only been at the farm since March 16th. She'd arrived just days before the murders. Did she hear the footsteps? Did Andreas tell her about the strange occurrences? We'll never know. But Maria Baumgartner walked into a nightmare she couldn't have anticipated, hired to work at a farm that was already being haunted by something or someone with terrible intentions. March 31st, 1922, was a Friday. It was the last day the Grubber family was seen alive. Several neighbors saw Andreas working in the fields that afternoon. Victoria was spotted doing some household tasks. Everything appeared normal, or as normal as life at Hinterkeifeck ever was. As night fell on that last Friday of March, the family went about their evening routines. The children were put to bed. The animals were secured for the night. The fires were banked. And somewhere, in the gathering darkness, their killer was preparing to strike. What happened next was brutal beyond comprehension. But before we describe the horror of that night, we need to understand something crucial. The killer didn't just strike and flee. What they did after the murders might be even more disturbing than the murders themselves. The exact sequence of events on the night of March 31st has been reconstructed from the crime scene evidence and the positions of the bodies. What emerges is a picture of methodical, calculated violence. The attack began in the barn. Andreas Grubber, his daughter Victoria, and her daughter 7-year-old Kazilia had gone out to the barn that evening, likely to tend to the animals or complete some final chores before bed. It was routine, something they'd done countless times before. The barn was attached to the main house, accessible through a covered walkway. It would have been dark, lit only by lanterns, the shadows deep and concealing. The killer was waiting. The weapon was a mattock, a farming tool similar to a pickaxe with a broad blade on one end. It was heavy, designed for breaking hard ground, and in the hands of someone with murderous intent, it was devastatingly effective. Andreas was struck first. The blow came from behind, a crushing impact to the head that dropped him immediately. He died there, in his own barn, surrounded by his animals. Victoria saw her father killed. She tried to flee, tried to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The barn door was the only exit, and the killer stood between her and safety. She was struck down next to her father, the blows raining down until she moved no more. Then came perhaps the most heartbreaking detail of the entire case. Young Kazilia, 7 years old, witnessed the murders of her grandfather and mother. In her terror, she did what any child would do. She tried to hide. She clawed at the ground, trying to burrow into the straw and dirt of the barn floor, perhaps hoping that if she couldn't see the killer couldn't see her. The autopsy would later reveal that Kazilia had torn out clumps of her own hair in her fear and desperation. But hiding was impossible. The killer found her and struck her down in that barn, ending her short life with the same weapon that had killed her family. But Kazilia didn't die immediately. The autopsy would reveal something that makes this already unbearable crime even more horrific. Kazilia survived for hours after the attack. She lay in that barn, gravely wounded, in unimaginable pain, slowly dying. And during those hours, the killer was still in the house, moving through the building, killing the others, and Kazilia would have heard it all. After the barn murders, the killer entered the main house. The elderly Kazilia Grubber, 72 years old, was in her bedroom. Whether she heard the commotion from the barn or was asleep, we don't know. But she never had a chance to defend herself. She was killed in her bed, struck down in the place where she should have been safest. 2-year-old Joseph was in another bedroom, likely already asleep for the night. He was killed where he lay, a toddler who never even knew danger was coming. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, was in her quarters. She was the final victim. Maria had been at the farm for less than 2 weeks. She barely knew the family, barely knew the layout of the remote farmstead. She must have heard the sounds, must have known something terrible was happening. But trapped in an unfamiliar house with a killer, what could she do? She was found in her room, killed like the others. 6 people, dead in their own home. 3 generations of one family, wiped out in a single night of violence. And the weapon, the blooded mattock, was left at the scene, discarded by a killer who apparently felt no need to hide the evidence of what they'd done. But here's where this case transcends from merely a brutal murder into something that defies easy explanation. Because after killing 6 people, the murderer didn't flee into the night. They stayed. The crime scene investigation would later reveal evidence that the killer spent days at Hinterkeifeck after the murders. Days living in the house with the corpses. And this is where the psychological horror of this case reaches its peak. The killer fed the animals. Neighbors later reported that the livestock had been cared for in the days after the murders. The cows were milked. The chickens were fed. The farm animals showed no signs of distress or neglect. Someone was maintaining them, going through the daily routines of farm life while surrounded by the dead. The killer ate food from the family's kitchen. Evidence showed that meals had been prepared and consumed in the days following the murders. Someone sat at the Grubber's table, perhaps in the same chairs where the family had sat for their last meal, and calmly ate while the bodies lay just rooms away. Most disturbing of all, the killer kept the fires going. Neighbors saw smoke rising from Hinterkaifeck's chimney for days after March 31st. They assumed the family was simply going about their normal business. They had no idea that the smoke was being produced by a murderer who was keeping warm while deciding what to do next, or perhaps simply feeling no urgency to leave. Why? Why would someone stay in a house full of corpses? Why tend to animals and keep fires burning and eat meals in a place that must have been filled with the smell of death? There are a few possible explanations, none of them entirely satisfying. The killer might have been waiting for something or someone. Perhaps they were searching for something in the house and needed time to find it. Perhaps they were waiting for accomplices or for a specific date or event. The killer might have had nowhere else to go. If this was someone who'd been living secretly at the farm, hiding in the attic or outbuildings, the farm might have been their only shelter. Leaving meant exposure, risking being seen and remembered. The killer might have been psychologically disturbed in ways we can't fully comprehend. Someone who could calmly live among the bodies of their victims, maintaining a grotesque semblance of normal life, was clearly not thinking or feeling like a normal person. Or perhaps most chilling of all, the killer might have been making a point. Demonstrating their control, their lack of fear, their contempt for the victims and anyone who might come looking for them. Staying wasn't necessity, it was a statement. Whatever the reason, the killer eventually left Hinterkaifeck. They walked away from the farmstead, possibly taking some items with them but leaving the murder weapon and most evidence behind. They vanished into the German countryside, into history, never to be identified. The Gruber family's absence wasn't noticed immediately. Hinterkaifeck was isolated, and it wasn't unusual for the family to go days without being seen. The smoke from the chimney suggested everything was normal. Neighbors had no reason to be concerned. But by Tuesday, April 4th, 4 days after the murders, people began to worry. Young Kazilia hadn't attended school since Friday, which was unusual. The family hadn't been seen in the village. Attempts to visit the farm found it eerily quiet, though smoke continued to rise from the chimney. Some neighbors approached the house but didn't enter. They called out but received no response. The doors were locked from the inside. They assumed the family must be away, though the smoking chimney and the cared-for animals suggested someone was there. It was strange, but not yet alarming enough to force entry. Finally, on April 4th, neighbors decided something was seriously wrong. They forced their way into the farmhouse, calling for the family, expecting perhaps to find them ill or injured. What they found instead was a scene from a nightmare. The bodies of young Joseph and elderly Kazilia Gruber were discovered in the house, where they'd been killed in their beds. The maid, Maria, was found in her quarters. All had been struck with tremendous force, their injury severe and immediately fatal. But where were Andreas, Victoria, and young Kazilia? The search continued, and the neighbors made their way to the barn. There, covered with hay and straw, as if someone had made a half-hearted attempt to conceal them, they found the remaining 3 victims. Andreas and Victoria lay side by side. And there was young Kazilia, who'd torn out her own hair as she tried to hide, who'd lived for hours after being struck, finally succumbing to her injuries in that cold barn while the killer moved through her home. The neighbors fled, horrified, and contacted authorities. The police arrived, followed by investigators, forensic experts, and eventually, throngs of curious onlookers who descended on the isolated farm to gawk at the scene of such a sensational crime. The investigation that followed was extensive, but it was also hampered by several factors. This was 1922, before many modern forensic techniques existed. There was no DNA testing, no advanced blood analysis, limited fingerprinting capabilities. The crime scene had been contaminated by the neighbors who discovered the bodies and by the crowds of people who visited in the days following the discovery. Additionally, the delay in discovering the bodies meant crucial evidence had degraded. The killer had had days to clean up, to remove evidence, to blur the details of what had happened. But investigators did gather what they could. The murder weapon, the mattock, was examined. It had come from the farm itself, a tool the killer had likely grabbed from the barn or a storage area. There were no unusual fingerprints, or at least none that could be meaningfully analyzed with 1922 technology. The bodies were examined by medical experts. The autopsies confirmed what the injuries suggested. All 6 had been killed with the same weapon, a heavy-bladed tool swung with considerable force. The blows had been devastating, causing massive trauma. Death would have been rapid for most, though not for poor young Kazilia, who'd suffered for hours. One detail from the autopsies disturbed investigators. The pattern of injuries suggested the killer was experienced with a mattock, knew how to swing it for maximum effect. This pointed to someone familiar with farm work, someone strong and comfortable using such tools. Investigators interviewed everyone who'd had contact with the Grubber family. They compiled lists of potential suspects. They pursued every lead, every rumor, every suspicion. And there were many suspects to consider. But before we discuss the suspects and theories, we need to address the question that makes this case not just a murder mystery, but a puzzle that seems to defy rational explanation. How did the killer remain undetected in the days after the murders? Neighbors saw smoke from the chimney. They must have been close to the farmhouse at various points. How did the killer avoid being seen? How did they move around the property, tending animals and maintaining fires, without anyone noticing? The only explanation is that the killer was extraordinarily careful, watching for approaching visitors and hiding whenever anyone came near. Or, more disturbing, that the killer knew the rhythms of the farm and the patterns of the neighbors so well that they could predict when it was safe to move around and when they needed to stay hidden. This knowledge suggests someone who'd been watching the farm for some time. Someone who'd studied the family's routines, the neighbors' habits, the lay of the land. This wasn't an impulsive crime. This was planned, prepared for, executed with chilling precision. And that brings us back to those footsteps in the attic, those mysterious footprints in the snow. Because there's one theory about this case that, while impossible to prove, is more terrifying than any other explanation. What if the killer had been living at Hinterkaifeck for weeks or months before the murders? What if those footsteps Andreas heard weren't paranormal, but very real footsteps of someone hiding in the attic? What if the missing and reappearing keys and tools weren't Andreas's failing memory, but evidence of someone secretly using the family's possessions? What if the killer was already in the house, living in the shadows, watching the family, waiting for the right moment to strike? This theory explains the inexplicable footprints that led to the farm but not away. It explains how the killer knew the property so well, how they could tend the animals and navigate the buildings. It explains why they stayed for days after the murders. They were already there. The farm was already their home, in a twisted, nightmarish way. If this theory is correct, then the Grubber family's final days were even more horrifying than we thought. They were living with their future killer, hearing them move around above their heads, finding evidence of their presence, but never quite believing that the danger was real, that someone was literally living in their attic, waiting to murder them all. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders was one of the largest in Bavaria's history at that time. Over 100 people were interviewed. Countless leads were pursued. Several suspects were seriously investigated, and a few were even arrested, though never convicted. Let's examine the main suspects and theories that emerged. The mysterious stranger theory: several witnesses reported seeing an unfamiliar man in the area around the time of the murders. Descriptions varied, but they generally described someone who didn't belong, someone who seemed out of place in the rural area. One witness reported seeing a man walking away from the direction of Hinterkaifeck on April 1st, the day after the murders. The man was described as disheveled, walking quickly, as if fleeing from something. But this witness didn't come forward until days later, and by then, the trail was cold. Could this have been the killer? Possibly. But without a better description or any way to identify this person, it was a dead end. Investigators searched for traveling laborers, vagrants, or strangers who'd been in the area, but they found no one who fit the description and had any connection to the farm. The disgruntled worker theory: Hinterkaifeck employed seasonal workers and day laborers for various farm tasks. Andreas Grubber was known to be a difficult employer, harsh and unfair according to some who'd worked for him. Had one of these workers decided to take revenge? Investigators looked into everyone who'd worked at the farm in recent years. They found several people who disliked Andreas, who'd left on bad terms or felt they'd been mistreated. But disliking your former employer is a long way from committing mass murder. None of these workers had clear opportunities to commit the crime, and most had solid alibis. One former laborer was investigated more seriously. He'd left the farm after a dispute with Andreas and had made threatening statements. He was brought in for questioning, but he had an alibi for the night of the murders and there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. He was eventually released. The family secret theory: this is where the case gets even darker, if that's possible. There were rumors about the Grubber family, whispers that spoke of terrible secrets hidden behind the walls of Hinterkaifeck. Andreas Grubber had allegedly been involved in an incestuous relationship with his daughter, Victoria. The rumors suggested that young Joseph, Victoria's 2-year-old son, was not the child of her dead husband Carl Gabriel, but rather the product of this abuse. These rumors were never conclusively proven, but they were persistent enough that investigators took them seriously. If true, they provided several potential motives for murder. Perhaps Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, hadn't died in the war. Perhaps he discovered the abuse, and Andreas had killed him to keep the secret. Perhaps Carl had only been presumed dead but was actually alive, and he'd returned to take revenge on Andreas and a family he saw as corrupted. This theory was pursued vigorously. Investigators tried to confirm whether Carl Gabriel was truly dead or might still be alive. They searched for evidence that he might have returned to the area. But they found nothing conclusive. Carl Gabriel's fate remained as mysterious as the identity of the Hinterkaifeck killer. Another variation on this theory suggested that someone else, perhaps a relative or someone in the village who knew about the abuse, had been so disgusted and enraged that they'd taken it upon themselves to punish the family. But again, no evidence supported this theory, and it remained speculation. The robbery gone wrong theory: could this have been a simple robbery that escalated into murder? Perhaps someone knew that Andreas kept money at the farm, broke in to steal it, and killed the family to eliminate witnesses? This theory has some problems. First, while some money was missing from the farm, it wasn't a significant amount. The house hadn't been ransacked the way you'd expect in a robbery. Most valuables were left untouched. Second, the methodical nature of the killings doesn't fit a panicked robber eliminating witnesses. This was deliberate, planned, almost ritualistic in its execution. And why would a robber stay at the farm for days afterward? The robbery theory was eventually largely dismissed, though it couldn't be entirely ruled out. The hidden resident theory: this is the theory that, while impossible to prove, seems to explain more aspects of the case than any other. The theory that someone had been living secretly at Hinterkaifeck, hiding in the attic or outbuildings, surviving on stolen food, watching the family, waiting. This would explain the footsteps in the attic that Andreas reported. It would explain the missing keys and tools that later reappeared. It would explain the newspaper that no one had bought, perhaps brought by the hidden resident from a trip to town. It would explain the footprints in the snow that led to the farm but not away. It would explain how the killer knew the farm so intimately, how they could care for the animals and navigate the buildings in the dark. It would explain why they stayed for days after the murders. They were already living there. The murders might have even been motivated by fear of discovery, a desperate act by someone whose hiding place was about to be exposed. But who could this person have been? A vagrant who'd found the farm and decided to squat there? A former worker who'd never truly left? Someone with a grudge who was biding their time? Or, most disturbing of all, Carl Gabriel himself? Could Victoria's supposedly dead husband have been alive all along, hiding at his own former home, driven mad by whatever he discovered about his wife and father-in-law, plotting his revenge over months of secret observation? This theory is compelling but ultimately unprovable. If someone had been living at Hinterkaifeck, they left no definitive evidence beyond the circumstantial clues that terrified the Gruber family in their final days. The official investigation concludes despite the extensive investigation, despite the numerous suspects and theories, the police were unable to solve the Hinterkaifeck murders. By the late 1920s, the active investigation wound down. The case remained officially open but without any real progress. Over the following decades, various investigators would revisit the case. New theories would be proposed. Occasionally, someone would come forward claiming to have new information or confessing to involvement. But nothing panned out. The murders remained unsolved. In 1923, the farmstead itself was demolished. The buildings where the family had been killed were torn down, the land eventually absorbed into neighboring properties. Nothing remains of Hinterkaifeck today. The physical location of one of Germany's most notorious murders has been erased from the landscape. But the mystery hasn't been erased. It persists, passed down through generations, documented in books and articles, and now online forums where amateur investigators continue to debate what happened on that isolated farm over a century ago. More than 100 years have passed since the Hinterkaifeck murders. The people involved, victims and potential suspects alike, are all long dead. Anyone who might have had information about the crime is gone. And still, the questions remain. Who killed the Gruber family? We may never know for certain. But perhaps more disturbing than the question of who is the question of why the case has never been solved despite abundant evidence. The killer left the murder weapon. They left footprints and fingerprints, though 1922 forensics couldn't do much with them. They stayed at the scene for days, leaving more evidence with every hour that passed. They made no apparent effort to cover their tracks effectively. This suggests either incredible arrogance or psychological disturbance so profound that the killer simply didn't care about being caught. Or perhaps it suggests something else, something we haven't considered. What if the killer was someone who couldn't be prosecuted or pursued? What if they were someone protected, someone whose identity was deliberately concealed by authorities for reasons we don't understand? This ventures into conspiracy theory territory, but it's worth noting that 1922 Germany was a chaotic place. The country was still reeling from World War I. The economy was in shambles, political instability was rampant. It's not impossible that someone with power or connections could have influenced the investigation, could have ensured certain avenues weren't pursued, certain suspects weren't seriously investigated. But there's no evidence for this. It's speculation built on the frustration of an unsolved case, the human need to find explanations even where none exist. Let's consider instead the unexplained elements of the case, the details that continue to disturb and perplex. The footsteps in the attic. Multiple family members heard these. Andreas investigated multiple times and found nothing. But someone was making those sounds. Were they the killer, already living in the house? Were they a paranormal phenomenon, warnings from beyond trying to alert the family to danger? Or were they, as skeptics might suggest, simply the normal sounds of an old house misinterpreted by a family already on edge? The most rational explanation is that someone was hiding in the attic. But if so, they were never caught, never identified, never seen except as footprints in snow and sounds in the night. They were a ghost that became real, a nightmare that materialized into a mattock-wielding killer. The footprints in the snow. How do you explain footprints that lead to a location but not away? The most obvious answer is that the person who made them is still at that location, having never left. But Andreas searched and found no one. Unless the person was in the attic, hidden among the stored items, remaining perfectly still while Andreas searched below. Or unless the person knew the house well enough to move through it avoiding detection, perhaps using routes Andreas didn't think to check. Or, less rationally but impossible to completely dismiss, the footprints were indeed paranormal, a manifestation of something trying to warn the family or perhaps the echo of what was to come, the killer's future approach somehow imprinted on the snow before it occurred. The missing newspaper and keys objects appearing and disappearing without explanation. If we accept that someone was secretly living at the farm, this makes sense. The hidden resident would need to take supplies and tools, would occasionally make mistakes and take things from obvious places, then would return them hoping no one noticed they'd been gone. But if there was no hidden resident, if the killer only came to the farm on the night of the murders, then how do we explain these earlier incidents? Were they unrelated, coincidences that happened to occur in the months before the family was killed? Or were they early reconnaissance, the killer visiting the farm on previous occasions, studying it, preparing? Why did they stay? This is perhaps the most disturbing question of all. After committing 6 murders, why would anyone stay in the house for days? The risk of discovery was enormous. Every hour that passed was another chance for someone to visit the farm, to find the bodies, to catch the killer in the act. Was it practical? Did they need time to search for something? Were they hiding something or taking things that required time to find and gather? Was it psychological? Did they feel ownership of the space, a right to remain in the house they just cleared of its inhabitants?